pressure. But history tells a different story. Ordinary people, teachers, parents, neighbors, have committed acts of unthinkable harm, not because they were monsters, but because they were human, and because they were placed in systems that quietly reprogrammed their behavior. This is what psychologist Philip Zimbardo called the Lucifer Effect, the process by which good people are gradually turned into agents of harm, through context, authority, and psychological distance. And this isn't just a theory, it's a mirror that doesn't ask, what's wrong with them? But instead, if the system asked it of me, would I say no? Because evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in the form of silence, obedience, or comfort. To understand how darkness spreads, we first have to understand the system that lets it in. Part 1. The Lucifer Effect. When systems override the soul. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted what would become one of the most controversial and revealing studies in modern psychology: the Stanford Prison Experiment. 24 ordinary college students, all screened for psychological health, none with a history of aggression, just average, decent young adults. They were randomly assigned one of two roles: prisoner or guard. No special instructions, no training. Just a mock prison in the basement of Stanford's psychology building. And a system designed to observe what would happen when people stepped into power or submission. It didn't take long. Within 36 hours, some prisoners were having emotional breakdowns. By day 3, the guards had become authoritarian, cold, even cruel, humiliating, isolating, inventing punishments. And Zimbardo himself, the man overseeing the experiment, began to lose his objectivity. He stopped seeing students. He saw inmates and enforcers. By day 6, the study was shut down, not because of a dramatic outburst, but because someone from outside, someone untouched by the system, finally said, "This is wrong." And that's the point. No one in that room started out bad. There were no sociopaths, no villains, only context, only roles, only the quiet permission of the system. This is what Zimbardo later called the Lucifer Effect, the process by which good people become capable of great harm, not because of what's inside them, but because of the environment they're placed in. History is filled with examples. Nazi concentration camp guards, soldiers in genocidal regimes, citizens who watched neighbors disappear under totalitarian rule. These weren't monsters. They were parents, teachers, clerks, people who might have seemed just like us, until they weren't. And this is the uncomfortable truth. Evil is not always loud. It is systemic. It is situational. And it is dangerously subtle. People don't wake up one day and decide to cross a moral line. They don't decide. They drift. One silence, one rationalization, one act of obedience, until one day they look back and can't recognize who they've become. So ask yourself, is your goodness rooted in principle or in environment? Because when the system changes, so might you. But it's not just the system. Sometimes, it's the voice of authority itself that rewires our morality. Part 2. Authority, the quiet collapse of conscience. In the early 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram set out to explore a disturbing question. How far would an ordinary person go in obeying authority, even when it meant harming another human being? The setup was deceptively simple. Participants were told they were helping with a memory experiment. Their role: administer increasing electric shocks to a learner every time that person made a mistake. What they didn't know was that the learner was an actor. There were no actual shocks, but the screams, the pounding on the wall, the silence, all scripted. And yet, most participants continued. They kept turning up the voltage, even when they believed they were causing real pain. Even when the learner begged them to stop. They did it because a man in a lab coat said, "Please continue. The experiment requires it." Milgram's findings were shocking. Over 65% of participants delivered what they believed to be lethal shocks. Not because they were cruel, but because they were obedient. And this is what makes authority so dangerous. It doesn't always coerce through force. It persuades through legitimacy. We obey not because we want to cause harm, but because we believe someone else has judged that it's right. We shift the moral responsibility away from ourselves. And this isn't limited to the lab. It happens in offices, where employees follow unethical directives to protect their job. It happens in families, where silence is maintained to preserve the structure. It happens in institutions, religious, academic, political, where dissent is labeled disloyalty. We defer, we comply, and we tell ourselves we had no choice. But here's the truth. There is always a moment, however brief, where your conscience whispers, "This feels wrong." And in that moment, you are not powerless. You are accountable. So ask yourself, have you ever remained silent? Not because you agreed, but because the order came from above? That is the collapse of conscience. Not with rage, but with quiet agreement. And yet, even without orders, people can justify harm if they no longer see others as human. Part 3. Dehumanization. The disappearance of empathy. Before harm can be inflicted, something else must happen first. We must stop seeing the other as fully human. This is the essence of dehumanization, the psychological process by which we strip away the individuality, the dignity, and the emotional reality of another person, reducing them to a category, a label, or worse, an object. It's not a new concept. History is built on its machinery. In war, it's how soldiers are trained to kill. The enemy becomes not a father or son, but a threat, a target, a thing. In genocide, victims are called vermin, rats, cockroaches. Language collapses their humanity, so conscience doesn't have to confront it. Even in our modern world, you see it everywhere. In political discourse, opponents are labeled as traitors, degenerates, or the problem. On social media, people are reduced to avatars, attacked not for what they say, but for what they're assumed to represent. The further we push someone into the category of other, the easier it becomes to justify their suffering. We say, they deserved it. They're not like us. They brought it on themselves. And in that moment, empathy shuts down. Moral codes dissolve. And what remains is license. Not to disagree, but to destroy. This isn't just theoretical. Dehumanization fuels everything from bullying to state violence. It enables cruelty, not because we enjoy it, but because we've stopped recognizing the target as someone worth protecting. And this happens faster than we think. All it takes is repetition. A few headlines, a group consensus, a story told enough times that we start believing someone else's life matters less than ours. But here's the deeper truth. When we dehumanize others, we deform ourselves, because the ability to see humanity in others is what affirms it in us. And when empathy is lost outward, it begins to rot inward. So before harm is done with the hand, it's almost always done first. In language, and in the story we tell ourselves about who's worth caring for. But even when we see others clearly, there's still one battle we must face within ourselves. Part 4. The Shadow Self, what we refuse to admit. Carl Jung believed that every human being carries within them a second self, a darker twin that we spend most of our lives ignoring. He called it the shadow dash, the hidden side of our psyche made up of instincts, impulses, and traits we're taught to reject. It includes everything we're ashamed of, everything we deny, everything we disown in order to appear good. But it doesn't disappear. It waits. And it shows up in ways we often don't recognize. The sudden burst of rage at a trivial offense, the envy that poisons a friendship, the quiet pleasure at someone else's failure. These aren't random emotions. They're signals, manifestations of what we've buried. The more we repress the shadow, the more it leaks into our behavior. Not as deliberate evil, but as unconscious sabotage. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. In other words, when we refuse to face the darkness within, we risk becoming ruled by it, without even realizing it's happening. The greatest danger of the shadow is not that it exists, but that we pretend it doesn't. Because in that denial, we create a psychological blind spot. We project our disowned traits onto others. We say, they're selfish, they're dangerous, they're the problem. Never stopping to ask, where do those same impulses live in me? This is where the real conflict begins. Not between good people and bad people, but between the parts of ourselves we accept and the parts we exile. Jung believed that true wholeness only comes when we integrate the shadow, not act on it, but acknowledge it. To say, yes, I have rage. Yes, I am capable of harm. Yes, darkness lives in me too. Because once you name the shadow, you take back your power from it. You stop being a hostage to your hidden self, and you start becoming whole. The truth is, the greatest threat to our morality isn't evil out there. It's the parts of ourselves we refuse to see. And when we deny that shadow, we open the door to another danger: moral disengagement. Part 5. Moral disengagement. How the mind excuses harm. Psychologist Albert Bandura coined a concept that quietly explains one of the most disturbing truths about human behavior: how ordinary people commit harmful acts and still see themselves as good. He called it moral disengagement, a psychological mechanism that allows us to disconnect our actions from our moral identity. In simple terms, we do something wrong, but convince ourselves it's still okay. The mind rationalizes. It whispers, everyone does it. It's not that serious. It's for the greater good. I had no choice. And in doing so, we create distance between the behavior and the self. Not because we're evil, but because we're trying to protect a fragile internal story. I'm still a good person. This self-protection is powerful because for most people, seeing themselves as cruel, selfish, or cowardly is unbearable. So instead of changing the behavior, we change the narrative. We reframe the facts. We minimize the harm. We shift the blame. And we normalize the exception. I was just following orders. They deserved it. This is how the world works. And over time, we get better at it until it becomes instinct. Until it no longer feels like a compromise. Until one day, we stop feeling the discomfort. The inner conflict between values and actions goes silent. Morality rarely shatters. It evaporates, one quiet compromise at a time, not through betrayal, but through small, repeated negotiations with the self. It's death by 1,000 justifications. We've seen it in history. We see it in workplaces. We see it in politics. And if we look honestly, we see it in ourselves. Because no one is immune to this mechanism. The more pressure we're under, the more tempting the story becomes. This isn't really wrong. It's just how things are. And this is the real cost of moral disengagement. It doesn't just change how we act. It changes who we believe we are. And once that shift takes root, returning to integrity becomes harder. Not impossible, but harder. So how do we hold our ground when everything is pushing us to slip? Part 6. Moral courage. The willingness to stand alone. If moral disengagement is the silent erosion of ethics, then moral courage is the conscious force that holds the line. It's not the absence of fear, it's the decision to act rightly, despite the fear, despite the consequences, despite the cost. Moral courage is what drives someone to speak out against injustice, when staying silent would be safer. It's what moves a person to defend what's right, even when it risks reputation, career, or belonging. Think of Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat. Not because she lacked fear, but because she had conviction. Think of whistleblowers, who expose corruption within systems that demand silence, or employees who challenge unethical decisions. In organizations built on hierarchy and self-preservation, these aren't acts of grand heroism. They're often quiet, personal, and deeply lonely. Because doing the right thing rarely feels triumphant in the moment. It often feels isolating. That's why moral courage isn't instinctive. It must be cultivated, intentionally and consistently. Start with clarity. What are your non-negotiable values? Is it honesty, compassion, fairness, accountability? Write them down. Reflect on them. Then imagine this. You're in a meeting, and someone makes a discriminatory remark. You witness a colleague being unfairly treated. You're pressured to remain silent, complicit, or compliant. What do? This is called moral rehearsal. The practice of envisioning ethical action before it's required. It builds a kind of psychological muscle memory. Because the more often you rehearse integrity, the more likely you are to live it, especially when it's difficult. But here's the hard truth. You will lose things. Status, relationships, approval. That's why moral courage demands a deeper motivation. A loyalty to your future self, the one who looks back and says, "I didn't stay silent." Because in the end, there's a kind of strength that can't be seen from the outside, but is built in the private choices no one applauds. But courage does not thrive in isolation. It needs connection. Part 7. The power of influence. How you shape the system. It's easy to think that morality is a private matter, something shaped only by character and individual will. But human behavior rarely unfolds in isolation. It is contextual. And that means we are not only products of the system, we are also producers of it. This is where the concept of situational awareness becomes vital. It's the ability to step back and observe the unspoken rules around you. What gets rewarded here? What goes unquestioned? What's tolerated in silence? In many workplaces, for example, people follow unethical practices, not because they agree, but because no one else speaks up. The culture becomes the compass, and the silence becomes approval. But here's the truth. Systems don't maintain themselves. They are upheld, or undone, by human behavior, by small acts of resistance, or small acts of complicity. Think of Oskar Schindler. At first, he was a war profiteer, a businessman who benefited from the Nazi regime. But at some point, something shifted. He began to see not labor units, but people. He began to use his influence not to exploit, but to protect. By the end of the war, he had saved over 1,200 Jews from extermination, not because he started as a moral hero, but because he chose to use his position to bend the system toward justice. That's the point. You don't need to be a leader to have influence. You already have it, in how you speak, in what you tolerate, in what you challenge, in what you model. The question isn't whether you make a difference, it's what kind of difference are you making? Because the ripple effect is real. Your actions, even the quiet ones, become signals to those around you about what's acceptable and what's not. So ask yourself, what kind of system are you helping sustain through your presence, your choices, your silence? But even with influence, we're human, and we fail. So then what? Part 8. Self-forgiveness. Falling without staying down. At some point, we all fall short. We've stayed silent when we should have spoken. We've followed the group when we knew it was wrong. We've made choices that betrayed our own values. And when that happens, when the truth of our moral failure sinks in, shame follows close behind. But here's the danger. If we don't know how to forgive ourselves, that shame can harden into something more corrosive. It can become a reason to give up, to justify more wrongs with, "I've already failed. What difference does it make now?" This is how moral collapse sustains itself, not through guilt, but through unresolved guilt. And that's why self-forgiveness is essential, not as an excuse, not to escape responsibility, but to reclaim it. Self-forgiveness is the process of saying, yes, I was wrong, but that doesn't define who I will become. It invites us to turn toward our failure, not with denial, but with the intention to learn from it. And that starts with reflection. Ask yourself, what did I do? And why? What fear or pressure was I responding to? What value did I compromise? And most importantly, what would I choose now, knowing what I know? These are not comfortable questions, but they are transformative. Because real integrity isn't never falling, it's refusing to stay down. We must normalize the idea that growth comes through reckoning, that strength includes admitting weakness, that healing begins with owning our wounds, not hiding them. And that's where the paradox lies. Forgiving yourself doesn't make you less ethical. It makes you more capable of living ethically. Because you're no longer shackled to your past mistakes. You're learning from them. You're moving through them. You're choosing better, not because you're perfect, but because you're present. But failure is not the end. It's a frontier. But what you do next, that is where your power lives. And beyond guilt lies something even greater. A way forward. The final choice, and the heroic imagination. The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This is the truth we often forget. That good and evil aren't opposing tribes. They are potentials. Alive within each of us, awaiting the moment we choose. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, the same man who revealed how darkness spreads through systems, also introduced a counterforce, the heroic imagination. It's the belief that ordinary people can take extraordinary moral action. when it matters most. Not because they're perfect, not because they're fearless, but because they decide again and again to do what's right. When no one is watching, you don't need a title, you don't need a spotlight, you don't even need certainty. You just need the willingness to act with courage and compassion in the space where others hesitate. Every choice you make, how you speak, how you respond, what you tolerate, sends out signals, ethical ripples, not always seen, but always felt. The world doesn't need more people who are right. It needs more people who are willing to live rightly, and that final choice, to resist what's easy and embody what's true, belongs to you. The heroic imagination begins not in grand acts, but in quiet refusal.